Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's special lecture, co-hosted by Che Institute and the Indo-Pacific Democracy Forum. It is a great pleasure to welcome Professor Aïkenbery, one of the world's foremost scholars on international relations and the liberal international order. The Che Institute had the privilege of working with Professor Aïkenbery on several occasions, including the Trans-Pacific Dialogue in Washington, D.C., where he attends every year, and his insights have consistently helped us make sense of a rapidly changing world, and I'm confident today will be no exception. And Korea is not alone in this sentiment. Other like-minded allies, including Japan, are experiencing a similar sense of unease. After decades of participating in a US-led liberal order, we now face shifting rules, ambiguous expectations, and at times even blame. One American expert recently described in his book the current US posture as reciprocity and reindustrialization. But reciprocity as practiced today seemed to work under the principle of zero-sum games, and reindustrialization, framed as a national effort to redefine the yard of strategic industries, raises difficult questions for close partners like Korea and Japan, such as, can America realistically act alone? And are there any roles or contributions supposed to be done by these allies? Or what does it mean for countries that have long believed in interdependence and mutual benefits? The title of today's lecture, Global Disorder, captures this moment perfectly. Trade negotiations, even among allies, are one of the most evident reflections of a deep shift. The traditional principles of comparative advantages or open markets are giving way to narratives of grievance and protectionism. President Trump, since his second inauguration, has been pressuring allies and competitors alike under the name of negotiation by deliberately injecting uncertainty and confrontation into the system. In such a world, we are left to wonder, when will we be able to move beyond the zero-sum logic? Is there still a path toward a genuinely win-win international framework? This is precisely why today's lecture matters. We need Professor Aïkenbery's voice, clear, principled, and deeply informed, to help us reflect on the future of the liberal international order, the implications of Trump's presidency to the world, and whether a more cooperative and rule-based world is still within reach. Before I close, let me leave you with this question. Will we witness the return of a more predictable and principled world order in the foreseeable future? My hope is that today's discussion will bring us closer to the answer, a renewed vision for global cooperation, rooted in shared values and mutual respect, not unilateralism or coercion. I look forward to a rich and thought-provoking session. Thank you again for being here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. But before we start, I must say three thanks. First thanks, of course, to President Kim Il-suk and the staff at Che Institute. And my second thanks to second co-host, Indo-Pacific Democracy Forum, of which also I'm a member. And third thanks to, I see number of my old friends and also congressmen and many students. So thank thanks to you all for joining us today. And I'm the third Kim after Kim Yoo-seok and Kim Min-sung. And we have two Lees in our panel. But before we engage in our panel discussion, I'd like to first invite Professor John Aitkenbery to say, I think maybe 20, 30 minutes to set the stage. You have the floor.
Great, thank you. Great to be here. It's a pleasure to be back in this wonderful space with friends and colleagues, and it's just a great opportunity to discuss these issues. And as President Kim said in his very eloquent remarks, we are at a moment of great uncertainty. Global instability is kind of the watchword for today's moment. So let me say a little bit about that. And Won-Soo, thank you so much for chairing, and for my colleagues to join me on stage here for this conversation. So it's a real honor to be with so many friends and colleagues. Well, we really are all watching the same spectacle. We're watching the United States under President Trump really take the United States in a new direction, to, in some sense, step forward as a kind of revisionist state. It's somewhat disorienting to have the leading, most powerful state in the world, in some sense, taking a wrecking ball or a kind of instrument of bashing institutions to the norms and rules and institutions of the post-war order, rules and norms that the U.S. has been instrumental in creating. So it's an odd situation to have the state that was the leader of this order now, in some sense, being the leader of the undermining of this order. So it's a remarkable moment in world historical terms. We really are in uncharted territory. The U.S. is clearly redefining its role in the international system. The role is in some sense in upheaval. Globally and more generally, the global multilateral order is in a kind of weak state. Global multilateral institutions for problem solving, from Bretton Woods, the IMF, the World Bank, the WHO, these multilateral UN-based institutions are in many ways also in need of reform and updating. And so the possibilities of future outcomes are as great as they've ever been before. The kind of range of possible futures are as great as we've seen in many generations. The possibilities of movement towards order based on pan-regionalism, spheres of influence, and the possibility that we can get back to a rules-based liberal international order, as I will talk about today. So we are at a moment when the most basic questions are up for grabs. What are the sources of international order? Can democracies make a comeback? Can U.S.-China find a way to develop guardrails and rules of the road to establish a path towards coexistence? And can the U.S. work with other states to make a better future for the liberal international order, by which I mean an open, rules-based, or at least loosely rules-based cooperative order organized around and led by the liberal democracies. Is this still possible? About a month ago, I went to Oxford and was asked to give a lecture on, is the liberal international order dead? So it was kind of a striking question. And as a good academic, my answer was yes and no. And in some ways, that's my thesis today, that the US-led order, the order organized around American hegemony, is clearly weakening and, in some sense, giving way. But the larger forces of liberal internationalism, of liberal modernity, are still alive. So the Aitkenbery rule is that the worse it gets in world politics, the further you have to go back in history to see an upward arc of progress in world politics. So we have to go further and further back to see the kind of struggles that have always been part of world politics over the decades and centuries, trying to come to some agreement on rules and institutions of international order. Liberal internationalism has been around for 250 years, coming into existence with the age of democratic revolutions. And through those decades and centuries, it's had many ups and downs. It's had golden eras, and it has had close-run things. It has had great moments of triumph, but it's also had deep contestation with other kinds of international projects, not least during World War II and during the Cold War. So we have to remember that it's always a struggle, and there's never a clear-cut final resolution to what the rules and institutions of international order should be. As a liberal internationalist, for me, I pose the question, what are the fundamental convictions that we have about why liberal international order has value and has a future? And for me, there are kind of four convictions which I would argue are still formidable, but if we were to say that the liberal international order is dying or dead, we would have to say these four convictions no longer hold. The first one is simply that open trade, exchange between countries is mutually beneficial, properly managed. That is to say that David Ricardo, Adam Smith, notions of specialization, trade, comparative advantage still hold. So that's number one. Number two, rules and institutions, again, properly organized, can facilitate cooperation, that institutions matter, that problem solving is best pursued globally together, where countries, all of which have some stake in problem solving and some capacity to add value to problem solving, can be part of the overall organized effort. So that would be number two. Number three, liberal democracies have a special comparative advantage in cooperation, that liberal democracies have a capacity to work with each other, to trust each other, to find ways in which they can work together through common institutions and experiences. They have a history, they have common narratives, they have a history of success working together. So number three, democracies still have an important role in fostering global order. And then finally, under conditions of growing interdependence, which is really the world that we are in today and that we will be in for the foreseeable future, the costs of making binding commitments that require governments to, in some sense, reduce their policy autonomy to make commitments that they need to uphold with other countries is less. The cost of that is less than the gains that are achieved through coordinating your policies. So in many ways, those are the great convictions of liberal internationalism, and the conversation we might want to have is, are those four convictions still relevant today? Now, is the liberal international order alive, well, or dead? I think, again, it matters what level of order we're talking about. So in some ways, the most vulnerable form of order, the order that is most fragmenting today, is really the US-led hegemonic order. So that clearly is an order that Trump is in some sense seeking to disentangle the United States from. This is the part of the order with the bargains and institutions that date to 1945, the norms of operation, all of this tied to American power. But there's a deeper level of order that goes beyond American power, that is tied to, as I said, the rise of liberal democracies, the 250 years of open societies attempting to organize themselves, creating a space for cooperation internationally. And this is still very much alive and well, I think, and has the kind of dynamic and energy that we can get back to on the other side of the Trump experience. So that what's really having problems staying in place, if you will, is that US-led order defined by the alliances, by the bargains that the US has struck with Europe and East Asia, the US support for public goods, underwriting global rules and institutions, funding global problem solving like the WHO and climate change. U.S. leadership in economic liberalization has been a critical part of the American leadership hegemonic role, tying American power to expanding opportunity with other countries through trade liberalization organized around rules that we associated originally with the GATT and now with the WTO. So these are all parts of the hegemonic order that are fragmenting and weakening. And then finally, the American commitment to what I would call hegemonic restraint. That is to say that the United States has had as its leadership style that it will not exercise power in all the ways that it could, that it is willing to stop short of exercising power through domination so that it can invite other countries to be part of its overall system. So strategic restraint, hegemonic restraint, all of these are features of the order that has been in place for roughly 80 years. And so what's happening today, in my view, is the world's community is in some sense trying to find out how to adjust to a world where that predictability of American leadership is no longer predictable. For 80 years, countries, whether they are friends or foes or countries in between, have had a kind of certainty that this framework of American hegemonic leadership would be there, that there would be the U.S. Playing this role. And now that is no longer certain. We don't know whether Trump is the beginning of a long-term shift or if Trump is a 4-year phenomenon. And so countries around the world have to figure out, what do we do? What are our strategic options? Do we, on the one hand, decide to write it out, to appease the United States, to try to keep the system in place so that the U.S. might be willing to come back and play that role again? Or do we jump to a new order? Do we begin to make what would be Plan B operations to move to a world where the U.S. is not as centrally located in our strategic space? And I think broadly speaking, countries including South Korea are making those decisions and trying to decide how can we keep the United States on the side of global order, but also reduce our exposure to uncertainties, to difficulties that will occur as the U.S. works through its Trumpian period. And so I think we're at a kind of place in international politics where all those options are on the table, and we're all trying to figure out how deep, how serious, how far-reaching is this weakening and erosion of American hegemonic leadership. It's a striking moment for this precisely because that order that the U.S. and its allies have built over all these decades has been extraordinarily successful. And the alternative orders do not look nearly as attractive. Think about that order across 75, 80 years, creating conditions for security, for prosperity, for glimmerings of social justice. Germany and France buried their enmities and launched the European Union. Germany and Japan became friends and partners in the trilateral world after having been mortal enemies during World War II, redefining themselves as great powers that no longer sought to be traditional great powers. They do not have, to this day, 80 years later, nuclear weapons. So this is a great achievement. The multilateral institutions that were created in the wake of World War II, the framework in which liberal democracies were able to reinvent themselves after World War II as social democracies, the welfare state, the building of more secure social societies that could ride out economic ups and downs, each doing it in its own country in a distinct way, in Europe and the UK, the US, and East Asia. It's all been very different, but it has been an extraordinary system in which all these different things can occur. Korea was originally not a member of the liberal democratic world, but in the face of having this system in place, this trilateral order, Korea was able to make its heroic transition in the 1980s towards liberal democracies, toward trade or export-oriented development, and join this larger complex of countries. Other countries as well have had this liberal order as a kind of mutual aid society, a kind of a platform for countries that are smaller and weaker to make transitions and to become part of that order as well. Not always successfully, but always available and much more attractive as a framework for global politics for countries making transitions than the imperial or harsh, brutal, anarchic orders that might be the alternatives. So these are all advantages and aspects of international order that I think we would want to try to preserve and celebrate and make the case that they still have value in today's world. Now let's turn to Trump. Trump clearly does not believe in this order, and it's fascinating to watch the kind of intellectual developments in Washington as Washington, in the form of the Trump administration, is walking back those historic commitments to the post-war US-led international order. It was remarkable, indeed kind of unsettling to hear Secretary of State Marco Rubio in his confirmation hearings in January say that US-led order is no longer in America's interest. It's now costing the United States more than it's benefiting the United States. And for me, it's the natural reaction was, I think he's misvaluating the order itself, that there are real problems with how you assign and measure value in this post-war order. And I think the great struggle in the United States for some of us who are still proponents of a cooperative rule-based order need to make the case that that order still has value, even to skeptics such as those around Trump. What Trump seems to be doing, and this is how I've kind of come to characterize the Trump revolution, is that it's sort of like a hostile takeover of America Incorporated. Think of the United States post-war order, this larger order the U.S. has led, as a kind of multinational corporation, always over 80 years run by a family that has passed it on to generation, embracing the history of that company and its value, wanting to pass it on to the next generation. And now we have a kind of hostile takeover by a private equity firm. And CEO Trump doesn't believe in that order in the sense that the leaders of that order believed in it in decades past. And so is now doing what often is done in these sort of hostile takeover kind of situations. You reevaluate what the different divisions are doing. You sell off underperforming assets. You monetize relationships. You rewrite contracts. You squeeze more asset value out of particular divisions. And this is what very much you see Trump doing, a kind of business opportunity to take this order that in some sense he wasn't really part of or saw the value of and is now leading it. And so I think that's where we are today. And there are a variety of strategies that I think you see attached to what Trump is doing. One is to reduce or shed what Trump sees as costly obligations. That would include the WHO and the climate accords, human rights agreements, foreign aid, the gutting of the USAID. These are all kind of reduce America's obligations to other countries through these various steps. Secondly, trying to squeeze more of the costs of various parts of this order out of other partners. So this is, of course, famously the complaint that Washington has that American allies are not paying their fair share of security. And there is a glimmer of truth to that, one would have to say, but one can go further than a reasonable kind of negotiation over those things and start to try to squeeze partners and to turn security alliances into not what we have understood them to be, a kind of sacred commitment to each other, but make it relational and contractual and contingent. We will provide security if you pay up. It's quite disturbing to hear the president talk about this in terms of NATO, that maybe Article 5 won't be honored. Maybe it will only be honored for those countries who are paying over 5%. So there is a new way in which the language and narratives of security have changed in this takeover of America Incorporated. The unbundling of bargains. One of the hallmarks of this order has been that we do our business in economics, but also in securities, that we are security partners, we do trade and investment with each other, and that partly because we are tied to each other in security, we manage in a respectful way economic disagreements. Yes, there are imbalances. Yes, there are problems in the trade relationship, but we do it in the context of being partners in a larger sense. And that kind of understanding has been eroded under the current administration. The separation of the old bargains, they were very clear between U.S. and Japan and U.S. and Germany, for example. Those have lost their efficacy. And then finally, what I worry about in some ways under the new management of America Incorporated is whether the U.S. might sell off some of its hegemonic assets in big, beautiful deals with other great powers. So I think about that in terms of what the U.S. might do in Ukraine, what the U.S. might do in Taiwan, what the U.S. might do in North Korea. So if you aren't tied to the larger package of obligations, commitments, and understanding of value that is attached to this order, it's easier to say, well, you stop testing and maybe we'll withdraw half of our troops. So the kind of quite risky, quite provocative kinds of deals that could possibly be in the offing. And in many ways, that is what I would say in summarizing my view of the new American foreign policy, is that it's difficult to classify. It's not certainly liberal internationalist, but it's not realist either. It's not realist in the restraint sense that American realists talk about realpolitik. It's not isolationist because Trump has been very active. Think about the bombing in Yemen and, of course, in Iran. Jacksonian is a term that's been used. Populist is a term that's been used. In many ways, I see it as a kind of illiberal internationalism, a kind of willingness to exercise power in new ways and to engage in a kind of transactionalism. And the through line in many ways is the deal, the transaction, the bargain. And that's what makes the tariff tool so attractive to a transactional politician, because you can just announce tariff levels go up and then all of a sudden the room vibrates and you've got to figure out, well, what are we going to do? He wants to raise the tariffs by 50%, and all of a sudden you're forced to get to the table to bargain. And that's precisely what the current leadership in Washington wants to do, to look for that deal, the handshake, the big, beautiful bargain. That kind of modus operandi is the new face of American foreign policy. Let me end with just a few more minutes to wrap up by trying to leave us all and introduce our discussion with a slightly more optimistic note. I do think that to come as close to an answer to the question as possible, that that there's more life left in an international order that's organized around those four convictions that I mentioned earlier. Why is that? Well, let's go through some of the key things very quickly. One is that there still is a liberal democratic world. The democracies, however you define them, are still 60% of world GNP. And yes, China is growing, but these countries are still a majority that have capacity to work in coalitional form, with or without the United States, to uphold their interests and preserve some stability in the institutions that they have been working with and in and through over the last decades. So that's number one. And some of that can be reinforced through new types of institutional reforms. I've written a piece in Foreign Affairs recently with Victor Cha on reforming the G7, making it a G9, adding South Korea, Australia, for example, maybe a G10. There are lots of different possibilities, but strengthening that fabric of multilateral or mini-lateral economic, political, and strategic cooperation between democracies. Secondly, I don't think America First is a grand strategy that's going to be successful over the long term. I think we can already see the kind of dysfunctions and difficulties, the kind of chaos that countries around the world just won't want to live with, including Americans. So there's a real sense that this is more reaction than it is a new vision of international order. Reactionary politics do ultimately give way to reform occasions, and it really behooves us as internationalists who care about international liberal order to prepare ourselves for the moment when the reactionism starts to give way, and now the question is, what do we do on the other side of that reactionism? Third point, the global south. I do think a lot of the world, indeed you could argue most of humanity, exists in the world that is neither the global north, which is the Western and Near Eastern global democracies, or the world of China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Most of the world is not in either one of those realms of East or West. It's the South. And that set of countries are eager, I would argue, not to see liberal international order end and disappear in favor of something else, such as spheres of influence, but quite the opposite, to see liberal internationalism deepen itself, because those countries, the global south, who are developmentally oriented, want an order that is relatively open, relatively rules-based, that's capable of generating investment and trade that they can take advantage of for development purposes. So the global south is not the enemy of liberal internationalism. There's room to build broader and deeper coalitions with them. And then finally, I'll just say that international orders do come and go. Great powers do rise and fall. But we do know that international orders are not built simply around power, that they're built around cooperative mechanisms that are likely to be supported if those mechanisms do things and solve problems that people care about. So when we talk about international order for the second quarter, third quarter, and final quarter of the 21st century, we need to ask what kind of international order will be best configured to solve problems we care about. Global warming, weapons of mass destruction, proliferation of various kinds, pandemics, all these different problems that are surely going to be part of our future. What kind of international order is most conducive to that kind of problem solving? And my argument today to you is that it would be an order that would be relatively inclusive, relatively rules-based, that would be tied to liberal democracies that are are embracing open societies and science-based expertise and the ability to adapt to new conditions by building new kinds of coalitions for problem solving. And so that functional demand of international order makes me, in the final analysis, cautiously optimistic that there is still future in the liberal international order. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. We really appreciate your realistic diagnosis of where liberal international order stands now. Deep trouble, no doubt about that. But still, with your passionate plea for keeping it, and I like very much your optimism about the future. And as a diplomat, we always use the term cautiously optimistic. But as you said, we have very convincing 4 logics which tells us why we should keep, preserve, and nurture liberal international order. And we'll have 2-part discussions. And in our first part, we will dig deeper into what Trumpism means, what it represents. And as you said, Trump may be trying to keep hegemonic part of the US-led hegemonic order without keeping its part of the bargain, which means the provision of global public goods and global leadership exercise, including their self-assumed role as world's police. But we all know that Trumpism is not short-lived because he left and he came back. If I told my American friends that if he ran in Korea, he would have 0 chance of being re-elected. At least I think one good part of the Korean politics. But that said, to allow Trump come back after a 4-year gap, we have to assume there must be some underlying changes going on in the American society. So we are afraid we may see a more of a divided America, 2 Americas, polarized America, and what it'll mean even after 4 years he left. So that'll be the first set of questions I want to pose to our panelists. Maybe we can start from Professor Lee, followed by another Professor Lee, then lastly, John.
Okay, the mic is on. I'm Suk-jung Lee, and representing Indo-Pacific Democracy Forum, and I'd like to thank Che Institute and CEO Kim Yoo-seok to host this valuable, very timely the lecture by respected Professor John Aitkenbery. So going back to the 2 questions put by our moderator, Ambassador Kim, how we understand the Trumpism. I think we can understand Trumpism from 2 aspects. One is domestic politics, and second is foreign policy and internationalism. For scholars like me studying democracy, Trumpism is one of illiberal populism. It's very anti-elite, it's anti-institution, it's anti-immigrants. So they are very much against DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also they are against the Congress. So many orders are done through the executive orders, so bypassing the legislature, and also he's kind of debunking many American government institutions, the closing USAID, and also busting the Ministry of Education, and also influencing the private, the prestigious universities in the USA. So it is a very illiberal populism based on MAGA, the making America great again movement, so to speak. So that's the kind of domestic aspect of Trumpism. Let's look at the external side. Trumpism in international relations, we understand that it is, of course, against multilateralism, and it is based on more on unilateralism and bilateralism. And Trumpism, I think it's a mixture of retrenchment. So it is not supporting global institutions, those very important four pillars, as Professor Aïkenbery has mentioned, as supporting the liberal international order. So the Trump administration is not paying dividend to United Nations. You know, the UN budget, regular budget, more than fifth is coming from America. So you can imagine many international organizations, including United Nations, is under severe budget constraints. Of course, he's working away from all important international treaties, including Paris Climate Change Treaty and many things. However, it's not a total retrenchment. His mantra is peace by strength. So he is selectively engaged in international affairs in the prioritized area, like he has done regionally. Rather than the Europe, he is moving to Indo-Pacific to constrain the Chinese influence, and also in regional conflict, he is for the peace in Ukraine war and in Gaza and then Iran, and maybe next the interest will be North Korea. Who knows? Okay, so it's a kind of retrenchment with a combination of a selective intervention through using the U.S. Influence. Whether is it going to be sustainable, I doubt. If you look at the domestic side, the American Registered Board is divided evenly one-third. One-third Democrats, one-third Republicans, one-third independent. Of course, when they are facing election, almost half and half are divided. So if you look at the last election, it's only 4% of difference popular vote between Harris and Trump. So don't estimate the other side of America. And second, would the Trump policy will be successful of using all this kind of tariffs, levying tariffs? I think that domestically, his economic policy may increase inflation, and he's the making America great again may not be that successful. I think rather than threatening other countries, it's better to train Americans for skilled workers to, if he really wants to, reindustrialize America. It's already, I'm passing 5 minutes. Let me stop here.
Now,
Okay.
Professor Lee just
Yep. First of all, well, I also thanks the organizer. Well, I will be very brief with diplomatic sense, but thank you will be sufficient. And regarding Trumpism, I think Trumpism is not just a passing phrase, passing phase, because this one, it is not merely led by Trump as an individual. In the Trump 1 period, we use the term Trumponology, the discipline studying the Donald Trump, who he is, what he's doing. But nowadays, what I'm seeing is the Trumpism reflects much deeper structural fatigue in the United States regarding its post-World War II global role, military burdens, alliance management, and economic openness. So America first has evolved from a sentiment into, it evolved from a sentiment to the systematic strategy, and that emphasizes sovereignty, unilateralism, and transactional foreign policy. So it is likely to become a long-term trend. Well, there can be Trumpism 2.3, 2.0, 2.1, 3.0. The version of the OS operating system will be upgraded, and we don't know who will be the portrait of that Trumpism, but it will highly likely persist beyond Trump himself. But there is a condition. Whether the Trumpism will persist. It will largely based on the performance and outcome of this Trump 2 period. And Trump has shown recently, for example, the bombing, the Iranian nuclear facilities, and showing some like tougher measure, sometimes too soft either or too hot, sometimes unpredictable measure. But if this kind of America first and America wins strategy will work, then the next president highly likely may follow this step. If those performances will be bad, on the contrary, then the next president will think about either kind of stepping back from this the unilateralism and maybe more seeking more on the multilateral side seeking. So what would happen to allies? The strategic adaptation. This is not something to deny. We already passed that phase. So denying is useless. Then can we revert the trend? For allies, it will be extremely difficult. Then the allies will adapt to the new rules and norms and game. The game is going on. So, engaging U.S. state, business, academias, and so we will talk about Trumpism, but at the same time, business sectors, industries are finding the ways to survive with this changing United States. And so, instead of state-to-state relations, maybe the strategic adaptation will likely happen in many sectoral domains, sometimes semiconductors, clean tech, AI governance. So the issue first, and then the value or the national, like big alignment later. Last point. The Trumpism is a social trend also. And what I would point out is, we talked about not just liberal international order, but the international order that we have discussed so far might have been intercapital order, linking Washington, D.C., Tokyo, London, Paris, and Seoul. But we have lost the big picture by connecting the dots of those big cities and capital. One example was the Brexit, 2016. Londoners didn't understand the sentiment of the mid-England and other the rural areas. Washington and New York is in 2016. They definitely believed the victory of Hillary Clinton, but it turned out that a lot of American people saw it in different ways. So we have to look at the new kind of public, maybe less intellectual, but more down to earth, more day-to-day business oriented, and more domestically focused. So that is what the Trump 2 is not just showing or revealing, it is reaffirming. So, that will be the Trumpism. And, what we have to do is whether or how Trump will leave or depart, but what comes next? what comes next, and different version of Trumpism, and we are only at the beginning chapter.
Thank you, Professor Lee Jae-sung. And now back to John. But before you speak, you said in your concluding remarks a lot of things about global institutions and unilateralism, international. But I think to prevent hostile takeover by Trumpism, how do you think you can restore American domestic political house back to order? I mean, Democrats have any strategy?
Well,
Next year's midterm will be critical.
Yes, well, democracies are messy, and there's always an opposition, and there are politicians on the side of stage waiting to come onto stage and provide new generation of leadership. We don't know. We didn't know when Obama was around until almost a year before the election. He was very much a kind of sudden emergence of a young leader from Illinois, and there are others like him in the state level American system. Andy Beshear from Kentucky, who's a Democrat, a veteran. He speaks the language, and this Professor Lee was making a very important point. The vernacular that internationalism, whatever country we're talking about, internationalism needs to be made something that's seen as desirable for average everyday people in the streets. It can't be seen as an elitist activity, and indeed that's the great challenge to make the case that you can't hide from the rest of the world, that there are important kind of enlightened self-interest that can lead you to be a stakeholder in global institutions and so forth. So it's been done each generation. So this is not something that is impossible. Moreover, and this is something that I want to bring to your attention, yes, America is polarized, and that's not going to go away. Even when Trump goes away, we are a divided country. And I'll say more about that in a minute, but we are also, there are some interesting majority views and on three things that matter for the future of American foreign policy. One is trade. There are large majorities who think that trade is good. You would think that wouldn't be the case given the tariff politics today, but actually Americans are not crazy about these tariffs, and public opinion on Trump economic performance has gone down as the tariffs have gone up. So trade, the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations has yearly polling data on, do you support trade agreements, broadly speaking? Fairness, of course, is a good term, and that's a part of what you would describe fair trade agreements, but there's large majorities in favor of that. Secondly, alliances. Americans love alliances, actually, and they are proud of them. They are proud that countries around the world like to work with the United States. It provides a kind of predictable set of relationships where we can be working together on a continuous basis on all these various forms of security. And then thirdly, this is what really struck me. I was totally surprised by this. There's a rising support for immigration in the United States. It's over 79% legal immigration, so not criminals who came into the country illegally. That's a tiny, tiny number of people. That's what Trump has blown into, the large immigration problem. But the truth is that America is a country composed of immigrants. And we are proud of that. And that has not disappeared. What has happened, I do think, is that this is the sociological issue of the society itself evolving, but the United States, like other liberal democracies, but in some sense mostly because of America's founding, it has had this set of principles that are built into the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the amendments to the Constitution, the 13th Amendment, which is the prohibition on slavery, the 14th, voting rights, citizenship for former slaves. This kind of America is a work in progress, that we have principles of fairness and all people are equal, and those principles were never fully implemented when we were founded. We still had the original sin of slavery. But over the decades and generations, there have been efforts to expand the opportunity for Americans. In the 1920s, women got the right to vote. So there's a kind of march of history of more people, of more different varieties having rights. And then in the period during the Obama administration, remember, Obama did not support legalization of gay marriage initially. But by the end of his term, he did, and then there was actually a kind of large, not overly large, but a large majority of Americans who supported this next step down that road towards equality. But what I think has happened is that as the march towards more inclusiveness, more rights for people who are more unusual to the average American, it starts to create that sense of anxiety and uncertainty about is that really the America we know? And so especially white, Christian, rural America feels like it's going too fast. We're changing too much. And so there's a kind of backlash that I think Trump has picked up on, and it's partly cooked into the problem of liberal societies that have these principles that if you continue to try to realize those principles, you force people to have to change their view about what we are as a society. And there's a strong vocal minority who are very worried about that. And so we have a federal system to make it even more of a problem where minorities, we have a Senate system, a federal system that creates more influence for rural states that have very few people, but they have great voting in Washington. So there's a kind of, the majority doesn't always get registered. There are the vocal minorities that get to capture government and try to stop the change. And that's really what Trump represents, I think. But I do think, two final things I'll just say. One is that I do think that there's a deeper kind of American story that politicians need to recapture. Obama did it in a great way. The narrative of we're not Democrats, we're not Republicans, we're Americans, and we love the country precisely because it's a place for lots of different types of people, and that immigration has made America strong. 47% of American Nobel Prize winners have been foreign-born. That's a secret to success. That hasn't disappeared. But I'll just end on the other side of the coin, and that is that, yes, I do think Professor Lee's right that this will not go away immediately when Trump goes away. It will somewhat go away because he's unique. He's very charismatic. He's a brilliant politician. Don't underestimate him. He has a way of operating, but his underlings, including his sons, it's not going to be the same. The next generation of Trumpians are not going to be quite as attractive to the base, let alone to everybody else. But I do think America is polarized, and the world, including South Korea, has to have strategies of reducing your exposure to the chaos and to the uncertainty, which means lots of things that I think we're going to talk about here.
Thank you, John. Also, sharing your optimism on domestic front of the U.S. And as Winston Churchill once said, I think we better be an optimist because, being a pessimist will not help solve any problems we are facing. As he said, maybe we have to be pessimist in analyzing the problems at our hand, but being an optimist in pursuing the solutions. And that said, I like to see maybe a visionary, younger democratic leader to emerge before next midterm election next year. That said, now I'd like to move to our second round of discussion, which concerns international aspects of Trumpism, how we have to cope with rising global disorder, weakening multilateralism, rising unilateralism, and growing gap between the provision of necessary global public good and the needs. I was shocked to see the recent number of, as John said, the other aspect of immigration is refugees. First, immigrants. When I joined UN about 17 years ago, the number was 20 million. Last year, it grew to 80 million, and this year, it grew to 120 million. Because conflicts are not being resolved, and new conflicts are being added up because of, first of all, retreat of the global leadership. So how we should make up for the weakening multilateralism, and maybe one solution, as John and Professor Lee Jae-sung said, multi-layered international networks composed of various set of minilateralism, plurilateralism, regionalism, and universal multilateralism with the UN as its symbol. So we have many tasks, and I think the coping mechanism we are looking for is, I think, much more complex and maybe looks fragmented. But I think we should find our solution, and it should be more issue-based and trying to find out who should be the members of that winning coalition for that minilateralism or plurilateralism. So for this round, I'll start with Professor Lee Jae-sung and Professor Lee Suk-jung and John.
Okay, thank you. So, well, we are lamenting nowadays a lot about the end, the deaths of or decline of liberal international order. But if we have a question how to restore liberal international order, then I would say, I think that question, that is a wrong question. The real problem and real issue is not the restoration, but actually redesign. A lot of multilateral institutional order and multilateral institutions, we are talking United Nations, WTO system, WHO system, they were born after the Second World War, and in late 1940s, 1950s, and in the 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we had another round of international liberal institutions emerging, like WTO was got from WTO system, upgraded liberal international order, but that's already quite some time ago. Well, WTO, I guess it's 30 years ago. And United Nations, much. Well, we are celebrating 60th, 70th anniversary. Okay, well, this is great. Well, they survived for 60, 70 years. But do we have to go back to the system right after the Second World War or after the fall of the Berlin Wall? The world has changed. A lot of the global south is not just a group of developing countries and poor countries. Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, India, Brazil, they are nowadays not just the poor developing countries. They have money, they have influence, they have power. So what we have to focus on is how to redesign this multilateral order. So no more discussion on nostalgia. We do have a nostalgia, but at some point we have to say a fair farewell to the old style multilateralism, but more about the equitable role sharing and influence sharing among the countries. Sometimes it can be led by the West, or it can be led by the West minus one, minus the United States, or what we call the global West. So global West, global South, and global East, maybe. We should be more open in composing the new redesign. And in this redesigning, what I would focus on would be two things. One is minilateralism. Instead of a big multilateral schemes, we can devise many minilateralism. Sometimes it can be the coalition of the willings in certain sector, certain area, and the second one is functionalism. A lot of institutions and a lot of multilateral order, minilateral order, will be written not in terms of grand narrative of value, but it will be very issue focused and performance based. So to sum up, a global order is certainly moving toward an overlapping governance, but don't lament. We are in a stage in a sense, of redesigning this kind of multilateral order. Just Donald Trump put the alarm bell and just opened the door, but didn't wait that somebody will come out. So the door was open. So universal bodies got weakened. Instead, issue-specific coalition, competing regional structures are emerging, and they are more performance and interest-based one. And here, middle powers must cushion the systemic shock and advanced kind of the middle powers will replace to some degree this influence sharing role, and global South must assert initiative. They may not be the leaders, but this time they should have a fair share and fair say in this new design. Okay.
I fully agree with what Professor Lee Jae-sung said. Just one note of caution. We have to redesign international institutions and liberal international order, but until we are sure about new institutional framework will work, we should not get rid of the existing global institutions.
Definitely.
So we have to pursue two tracks.
Exactly.
While trying to fix the problems with the existing institutions, while working on a brand new.
Yeah, well, certainly we
New
have to
international order.
design new architecture at home. Don't go out first.
Yeah.
It's either hot or cold.
Yeah,
So
that's what we do whenever we do some reforms at the companies or at any organization. Legacy system.
oh sure,
should be kept.
Yep, legacy matters.
So because I worried as a sort of a former UN official, if UN is gone, I mean, despite all the criticism and disappointment, frustration, but if UN is gone, who will feed 120 million refugees every day? That's huge task. No other nation or even minilateral or plurilateral organizations can take over. So that's just one note of caution.
Certainly,
to your
what
point.
I meant was not reconstructing, but kind of reforming and redesigning.
At the
So,
same time.
yeah,
Yes.
yep.
Fully agree.
Remodeling, I would say.
Remodeling.
Remodeling in apartment, in construction
Absolutely.
terms.
Professor Lee Suk-jung?
Yeah, I think the remodeling the global governance has been discussed, I guess, for the last 2 decades. This is another new argument. I think we've been hearing global disorder, I think even before the Trumpism, rise of Trumpism. I think in the larger context of this uncertainty is the international order is changing. It's not just end of or death of liberal international order, because there is no alternative order yet. However, I think after the end of Cold War, there was a unipolar movement led by U.S. However, after that, especially after 9/11, and we all talking about rise of a multipolarity, I think this conflicting multipolarity is creating kind of a some chaos, and the arrival of Trumpism is speeding up this disorder. So we've been talking about, the world is entering inflection point, and President Biden, his administration has repeatedly talking about this inflection point. So that's why we need to cooperate to build up the new order based on the more secure international corporations. Yes, of course, many are disappointed with the UN system because even though it's very the United Nations is still very important for peace and security and development and especially human rights, its capability to solve the global or regional issues has been kind of undermined. That's why we need some complementary mechanism that's like a regional cooperation and plurilateralism. Actually, during the Biden administration, we created many Indo-Pacific plurilateral mechanism, right? But I don't think President Trump is showing serious attention to strengthen this Indo-Pacific plurilateral mechanisms. So what we are going to do, I think it's very important for liberal democracy in the region to cooperate each other, especially Korea and Japan should work to persuade the USA the value of this multilateral cooperation within the Indo-Pacific, especially two important allies of the U.S., Korea and Japan. Our role is critical. And at the same time, of course, we've been talking a lot about middle power corporations, as Korea was one of a creator of MICTA during the Lee Myung-bak period. But this time, we need to be more focused on the middle power corporation, more emphasizing the importance of democratic values and human rights, all these liberal values. I think South Korea is in a very strong position because of our very popular the K-pop or this global soft power. So in that aspect, South Korea should do more, not only step up the international contribution to the IGOs and also to lead the democratic cooperation and unity, especially in the Indo-Pacific region. And also, I'd like to emphasize the Indo-Pacific democracies should cooperate with the liberal democracies in Europe, the Western European countries. So I'm one of a strong advocate. The European countries, European democracies, and the Indo-Pacific Asian democracies should work harder to support, to prevail, the international order prevail in this critical region. So let me stop here.
John, before you answer, I'd like to want a perspective from the floor, which asked about what role China should play. We talked a lot global West, maybe minus US, global South, and middle powers, and how China should step up to the plate?
That's a great question, and let me just make a couple of points that get to that final question. First of all, I agree with my colleagues that, and this is the way I might put it, that we started our conversation today, at least I did, making the argument that the Trump approach to international relations is causing problems and a kind of breakdown of an order that has been very successful. The other theme that we're kind of getting to around the edges of that conversation is that at the same time Trump provides the world a kind of a moment of opportunity to ask basic questions of how global architecture should be configured, and new actors who have kind of been in the shadows under unipolarity, under hegemony, can see what they might be able to accomplish. Middle powers, as Professor Lee had suggested. So there's already a creativeness to Indo-Pacific. The Biden administration was very good on this, starting with the Quad and other mini-lateral quasi-security arrangements and lots of other things. There's a creative moment between Japan and South Korea. I hope it continues. That could be given even more impetus by a Trump administration, because it, again, diversifies your security partnerships. It creates more lattice work of relationships. The second point I would make before I come to China is that it is for the United States and for Korea and for other countries that have been at the core of the system, trying to expand the leadership role to countries that would like to play a bigger role. And again, this is an old theme. I remember Secretary of State Hillary Clinton saying, we don't want a multipolar world. We want a multi-stakeholder world. That is to say, we want to have lots of different countries that are part of not a multipolar world, but a pluralistic leadership of a single world. And in some sense, that might be the vision that we're talking about here, and that will become more and more in demand. I've argued as a scholar that looking back across history, and I love the long term, 1,000-year kind of perspectives, but in the modern era, the way in which rules get generated in world politics is an interesting question. Where do rules and institutions come from? And historically, the Big Bang moments where we create order through building rules and institutions have been of two types. One is what I would call constitutional moments. After big wars, Vienna settlement, Westphalia before that, Versailles, and then hegemonic moments where powerful states organize things in their shadows and step up, and to the extent they calculate with enlightened self-interest, those hegemonic orders can be liberal. And to the extent they don't calculate according to their enlightened self-interest, they can be illiberal or coercive, but rules nonetheless. Those kind of structures of order seem to be less likely to occur in the next cycle of history than two other kinds of mechanisms for creating rules and institution. And one is coalitional rulemaking, which is this is what we're talking. Coalitional means smaller groups, not necessarily great powers, working on functional issues like international regulation of AI. The European Union is a great example of this possibility, because they have market space that if they come up with rules, other countries and regions may want to adopt the same rules because they want to get into the EU for market reasons. And then the fourth mechanism would be what I would call competitive rulemaking, and that is when China and the global South see themselves as offering rival visions of modernity, that there's reason to try to get to the larger global system and be the first mover for new rulemaking so that you can preempt the possibility that China will be the first mover. So competition can actually be a catalyst for innovation. And maybe China can do us a favor by forcing us to be a little smarter in our own rulemaking. Which brings us back to China, and I think we have to it's a double-edged sword. I think that China does throw up a huge challenge to liberal democracies. And in the past, great powers that have been of that sort have been useful to make liberal democracies rethink what is liberal internationalism. In my country, FDR during World War II reinvented liberalism for the modern era, the long New Deal, partly because there were alternative projects on offer in Moscow, in Berlin, and in Tokyo. So now an offer from Beijing provides incentives for us to up our game and create alternatives for open societies to have structures of governance that can reinforce rather than undermine the values that we care about in our domestic systems. But I do think, having said that coexistence and finding pathways to work together, it's important to remember during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the West, the United States worked together, found a cure for smallpox, worked on food security. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, started to work on arms control. So there is a record of countries that are hostile to each other in terms of overall projects of global order, who nonetheless have incentives based on what we might call existential threat considerations to work together. So even under those conditions, I think you can, it's again a kind of a two-track kind of approach.
Absolutely. We have looming existential threats against the whole humanity: nuclear winter, climate change, and even unchecked emerging technologies. So US-China has many reasons to work together to build a new international order. With that, I think we conclude our panel discussion, but I'd like to get maybe a couple of questions from the floor. Our Congressman, Kim Gun.
Yes, thank you for giving this opportunity to ask a question. One very simple and easy question to Dr. Aïkenbery. You mentioned about reducing exposure to Trumpian uncertainty for many countries to adopt. So just tell me, what is the best way to do it? What is the best way to reduce our exposure to Trumpian uncertainty?
That's the great big question. I think there are 3 or 4 strategies I think that have to be pursued. One is to reach out to other countries for security dialogues, starting with Japan, and trying to diversify your security partners. So that's number 1. Number 2, have a very, very intense dialogue with Washington on security, and keep the conversations going about how the issues of extended deterrence, the presence of nuclear weapons and the nuclear deterrent gets connected to the alliance, and how Seoul can have a stake in that kind of collaborative structure. I think that there's a lot of work that can be done there. I think it's very important, again, this is another conversation with Washington. The danger I see, that's the biggest danger coming down the road in terms of the alliance, is that Trump and Kim Jong-un will find some kind of deal where North Korea steps back from its intercontinental missile programs that are a threat to Washington, in exchange for some concessions that Washington might make that would not necessarily be welcome in Seoul. So a kind of breaking of that indivisibility of security bond by a kind of invidious bargain between Washington and Pyongyang. So heading that off before we get to that, I think I was talking with the ambassador earlier, asking the question, when do you think that big, beautiful meeting is going to take place between Tariff Man and Rocket Man? I just invented that. And I don't think it's going to happen soon because of Gaza, because of Iran, because of Ukraine. The Trump administration is very busy, and they are short-staffed by design. Rubio is Secretary of State and NSC director, and there are other people who have 2 or 3 or 4 hats. So it's hard to me imagine that there's kind of an early bargain that might take place. But as I mentioned, it was the thesis of my talk, Trump wants to make big, beautiful bargains, win the Nobel Peace Prize. And so we want to make sure that the bargain, if it were to come down the road, is one that we can all live with. And then I do think that being, again, this is the 4th point, would be to reach out to the larger grouping of democracies and global South partners, India, Brazil, starting to be part of a larger coalition that is not hegemonically oriented, but is tied to not alliances that would be forged between Korea and any number of these other countries, but strategic dialogues that diversify leadership and create opportunities for Seoul to have variety of different options under all sorts of different circumstances.
Thank you. Good advice. And I'm surprised to learn that we have a Chinese scholar visiting us and coming to your talk. Professor Ren Xiao from Beijing Foreign Study University.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm Ren Xiao from Fudan University in Shanghai, China, and also Beijing Foreign Studies University. It's a happy surprise to catch you with Professor Akenbury. And also, Madam Lee, you and I were together in a trilateral commission meeting at one point. The point I'm going to make is this. If US and China do not work together, the world is in trouble. And one would never overestimate the importance to understand China correctly, to understand China's future role in the world correctly. But unfortunately, I see many misperceptions from the United States, from South Korea, and so forth. I would like the panel to comment on that. Thank you.
So this is the question to all of our panels.
Yes, maybe Professor Akenbury and others.
Okay. So maybe we can start from Professor Jae-sung Lee.
Good luck.
China.
China. Okay. I don't think we can isolate China. China is, in a sense, too big and too important to be contained or kept aside. So what I would answer in 2 ways. One is what other countries can do and would do regarding China, and what China will do regarding other countries and other multilateral schemes. Because, well, what I'm seeing at this moment, what is going on is like a stalemate, but it's competing. But a lot of the countries in the middle, the both global South and I would say global West, even including European countries, Korea, and many other Asian countries, ASEAN, they are watching. But certainly there are cautions. Well, there are optimism to get engaged with China, to bring China more out to international world and international multilateral order. But well, in a sense, we are asking what kind of identity, what kind of identity China will have, what kind of narrative, and what kind of the construct. Well, I may avoid that terms, but what kind of the posture China will show and really deeper inside, because still in the mind of Korean people, 1960, 1970 South system, and what happened after the deployment of missile defense system, not missile attack system, still that remains firmly in the mind. So yes, China is an important country. We want to find a more, or the best way to get connected, to get engaged. But I think the first step is not just waiting for the other countries, especially global West, will get rid of the misconception, but what China have to show from inside it to outside world. Okay.
Both sides have
Both
to.
sides.
Thank you, Professor Lee Suk.
Yeah, since time is limited, I'll be short. China is a great civilizational power, and China is important in the future too. Whether it's that, the AI, all the digital and technological power, not to mention our conventional economic power. So of course, to South Korea and to the region in Indo-Pacific, China is so important. At the same, and it's very interesting, China is strongly advocating multilateralism while criticizing the USA. But at the same time, what China is really doing, they are dealing also bilaterally, China versus Africa, China versus the ASEAN. I hope there is more consistency in Chinese diplomacy as a principle and as a values. And also, China, it's very, with due all respect, China is contribute to global the governance, like paying 1/5 of contribution to United Nations. However, China as a political system is still opaque and it's unpredictable. So I hope the Chinese socialism can be evolved to give more trust and transparency and predictability. Then I think we will not have such a threat perception toward China. Yes.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think that dialogue is the answer, and it will have to come back as we had dialogue during the Cold War between two countries that had very different visions of themselves and each other, but there was a kind of evolution of stable relations. They ultimately, the Soviet Union and the United States came up with norms of coexistence. For example, they never did engage each other militarily directly. They had proxy wars. There were norms about what we do and what we don't do, and those haven't been established yet with China, and there is a lot of work to be done. I would say, as a liberal internationalist, to come back to the theme of this panel, I was in print for years on the importance of engaging China and the WTO as an opportunity to bring China in, to welcome them as a stakeholder. And one of the reasons why the liberal international position has weakened and Trumpianism has expanded is that China didn't quite do what we hoped it would do. It took what it could out of the liberal order on trade, but it didn't buy into the larger suite of responsibilities and commitments. And so my position in the United States has been weakened because of China's narrow conception of what they wanted to do internationally in this period of growth and engagement. So, and today, I don't agree with the hardline position against China, but I do think there is an important issue there with China in that there is a trade, it's a $1 trillion trade deficit with the United States, and it has to be managed. We cannot, industrial countries cannot lose their automobile industries, even if China, in its own capacity as a low-cost producer, could potentially supply the world with all automobiles. We have to find a way to balance trade, and in that sense, I'm not entirely an open trade and let things go. I think that there is a huge amount of stabilization negotiation that we have to pursue with China, and that's not bad. That's something that can be done. I do think that finally that there's a kind of possibility for creative order building in the world today based on a kind of competitive relationship between what I call the global East and the global West. That is to say, between China and its allies and the US and its allies, not to undermine the other, but to outcompete the other for providing good ideas for how we organize things and solve problems. A race to the top, not a race to the bottom. And so, again, the theme I would emphasize is that competition between us, offering very different views of what an ideal social system is, one closed, one open. I'm going to spend the rest of my life defending open societies, and in that sense, I am going to always be on the side opposite China, at least until China changes. But that doesn't preclude cooperation, finding common ground, and dealing with these problems of existential threats, which force us to be working together.
Yes, I fully agree with all the panelists that, as John just said, the arms control dialogue happened not when US-Soviet relationship was good. It happened when their relationship was so bad, but arms control dialogue opened the door for a broader political dialogue. And also, as John just said, maybe hegemonic competition between US and China may be inevitable, but they can compete for better ideas, better models, better institutions for the whole world. With that, I'm sorry to say I cannot give more time to the audience to ask the questions. I'm a bad time manager. But before we go away, I think at least we can take away two, I think, consensus points. First point is, yes, liberal international order is in deep trouble, in huge uncertainty, but we don't have better alternatives for convincing logics why liberal international order is better than any other model we have. And also still, we have some sense of optimism still in the US domestic politics. So I hope maybe better America, liberal America may emerge from next year's midterm election. And second point, as John said, and also Winston Churchill said, we should not give up on our hope and our efforts. We should keep at it because it is the best alternative we today have. My last point, thank you so much for our panelists. Please applaud them with a big hand. And also I want to thank Professor Lee and also Professor Yu, co-chair of the IPDF, and also President Kim and staff at Che Institute. Thank you so much.